The courtroom was silent, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that feels wrong, heavy, suffocating, like something important had just slipped through the cracks of reality. Because moments earlier, a verdict had been spoken, not guilty, and somewhere beneath that silence, a question refused to die. What if the truth had just been set free? It started, as these stories often do, with something that didn't add up. A young mother, a missing child, and 31 days of silence. 31 days. That was how long it took before anyone reported little Kaylee missing. Not hours, not days, a full month. And when investigators finally stepped in, the story they were given felt rehearsed, almost too neat. There was a nanny, a mysterious woman named Zani. She had taken Kaylee. That was the explanation. But here's where the first crack appeared. No one had ever seen Zani. No records, no employment history, no trace of her existence beyond the words of the mother herself. It wasn't just suspicious, it was impossible. As investigators dug deeper, they found something even more unsettling. The mother, during those 31 days, wasn't searching. She was partying. Photos surfaced, smiling, laughing, living as if nothing had happened. Nightclubs, friends, drinks, a life untouched by urgency or fear. To the public, it felt monstrous. To investigators, it felt calculated. Because grief leaves a mark. It changes you. And yet, there was no visible grief, only performance. Then came the car, abandoned, recovered, and carrying a smell that would become one of the most disturbing details in the entire case. The odor of decomposition. Experts would later testify the scent was consistent with a body that had been there. But here's where the story twisted again. The defense had an explanation. They argued it wasn't decomposition. It was garbage, rotting trash, food left to decay in the trunk. And suddenly, certainty turned into doubt. Because in a courtroom, doubt is everything. Months passed before Kaylee's remains were found. Hidden, discarded, reduced to bones in a wooded area not far from home. The discovery didn't bring closure. It raised even more questions. There was duct tape near the skull. But was it used to kill or to conceal? There was no clear cause of death, no definitive timeline, no direct evidence tying anyone to the act itself. And that changed everything. The prosecution built a story, a narrative of responsibility, negligence, possibly even intent. They pointed to the lies, the fake nanny, the delayed report, the behavior that didn't match a mother searching for her child. To them, it was obvious. Maybe not every detail was clear, but the pattern was. And patterns don't lie. But the defense didn't need to prove innocence. They only needed to create doubt. And they did something no one expected. They introduced an alternative story, a different version of events, one that shifted everything away from murder and into something darker, more complicated, an accident. They suggested Kaylee had drowned. That panic took over, that what followed wasn't a crime of intent, but a desperate attempt to cover up a tragic mistake. And suddenly, the entire case changed direction. Because now, the jury wasn't deciding what happened. They were deciding what could have happened. And that distinction, it was everything. In court, emotion battled logic. The prosecution showed a pattern of deception. The defense dismantled certainty piece by piece. Every claim met with an alternative. Every accusation softened by possibility. No eyewitness, no direct proof, no clear cause of death. Just fragments. And fragments don't always form a complete picture. Then came the verdict. Not guilty of murder, not guilty of manslaughter, only guilty of lying to law enforcement. The courtroom reacted instantly. Gasps, shock, disbelief. Outside, it was worse. Outrage spread like wildfire. To many, it felt like justice had failed, that something deeply wrong had just been validated. But inside the system, the rules had been followed. Because the law doesn't punish suspicion. It punishes certainty, and certainty was missing. But here's where the story becomes truly unsettling. Because long after the trial ended, long after the cameras disappeared, the questions didn't go away. They grew louder. What really happened during those 31 days? Why wait so long? Why construct a story that didn't exist? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what was the truth behind that silence? Psychologically, the case revealed something deeper, not just about guilt or innocence, but about perception. Because people don't just judge actions, they judge behavior. And behavior, in this case, felt wrong, too detached, too controlled, almost as if emotion had been switched off. But behavior isn't always proof, and that's where the danger lies. Because what if someone can appear guilty without being provably guilty? And what if the truth exists, but can't be proven? Years later, the case still lingers, not as a solved mystery, but as a fracture, a moment where law and belief split apart, where one said not guilty, and the other whispered, but something isn't right. And then something strange happened. A small detail resurfaced, one that had been overlooked, buried beneath the noise of the trial. A detail about the timeline, about the phone records, about a gap in the story that didn't quite fit either side. It wasn't enough to change the verdict, but it was enough to reopen the question. Because if that gap means what some believe it means, then the story we've been told might not just be incomplete, it might be wrong. And if that's true, then the real truth of what happened to Kaylee has never actually been revealed. The silence didn't end with the verdict. It evolved. Because when a case like this closes, but doesn't feel closed, people start looking again. Closer, harder, and sometimes they find the details everyone else missed. It began with something small, almost forgettable, a timestamp, buried deep within phone records that had already been presented, argued over, and seemingly exhausted during the trial. But here's the thing about evidence. Sometimes it's not what you see, it's what you don't question. On the surface, the timeline seemed chaotic, a blur of calls, movements, and shifting explanations. But one stretch of time stood out, a gap, not long enough to raise alarms at first glance, but too quiet when examined closely. And inside that gap was a digital footprint that didn't match the narrative either side had pushed. An internet search. Simple, ordinary, but chilling when placed in context, because it suggested something very specific had been looked up at a very specific time. A search that hinted at knowledge, preparation, or panic. During the trial, the prosecution had focused heavily on behavior, the lies, the delay, the contradictions, but they never fully anchored their case to this moment. Maybe it wasn't clear enough, maybe it didn't feel strong enough, or maybe it was simply overlooked in the storm of everything else. The defense, on the other hand, built their strategy on uncertainty, an accident, a cover-up born out of fear. But this search, it didn't sit comfortably inside that version either, because accidents don't usually come with curiosity about what happens next. So what did it mean? That's where things get unsettling, because psychologically, this detail opens a different door, not one of chaos, but of awareness. If someone searches for something specific in a moment like that, it suggests a shift, a transition from reaction to intention, from shock to decision. And that's a dangerous line, because once intention enters the picture, everything changes. But here's the problem. The search wasn't clean. There were discrepancies, questions about who actually made it, about whether the data had been fully understood, about whether it could even be proven beyond doubt. And in a courtroom, maybe isn't enough. Still outside the courtroom, maybe is everything. Because now, the case splits into three possible realities, not two. The first, the one the jury accepted, an accident, A tragic moment spiraling into fear, lies, and desperate concealment. A story of panic, not malice. The second, the one many believed from the beginning, a deliberate act, followed by calculated behavior designed to avoid responsibility. A story of control, not chaos. But the third possibility, that's where the silence gets louder. A moment that began as one thing and became another, not planned, not purely accidental, but something in between, a line crossed, not all at once, but in stages. A decision made not in advance, but in real time. And that possibility is the hardest to process, because it doesn't fit neatly into innocence or guilt. It lives in the gray. When investigators revisit cases like this, they don't just look for new evidence. They look for reinterpretation, because sometimes the truth was there all along, just misunderstood. That gap in the timeline, that single search, it forces a question no verdict can answer. Not just what happened, but when did it change? When did the situation shift from something manageable to something irreversible? When did silence replace action? When did the story begin? Because once you identify that moment, you don't just understand the case, you understand the mind behind it. And that's what makes this detail so powerful. It's not proof, but it's perspective. Years later, people still debate the meaning of that search. Some dismiss it entirely. Others see it as the missing piece. The one detail that, if fully understood, could tilt everything in a completely different direction. But here's the truth no one likes to admit. Even if you had the answer, it might not bring closure, because this case was never just about evidence. It was about perception, emotion, the uncomfortable realization that sometimes the system works exactly as it should and still leaves you questioning everything. And maybe that's the real reason this story won't disappear. Not because it's unsolved, but because it feels unresolved. Because deep down, people aren't just searching for what happened to Kaylee. They're searching for something else. Certainty. And in this case, certainty may be the one thing that never existed. But just when it seemed like every angle had been explored, another detail began to surface. Quietly, almost unnoticed. A pattern in statements. Subtle inconsistencies that didn't stand out individually, but together formed something unexpected. Not a contradiction, not exactly, but a shift. In language, the uncomfortable realization that sometimes the system works exactly as it should and still leaves you questioning everything. And maybe that's the real reason this story won't disappear. Not because it's unsolved, but because it feels unresolved. Because deep down, people aren't just searching for what happened to Kaylee. They're searching for something else. Certainty. And in this case, certainty may be the one thing that never existed. But just when it seemed like every angle had been explored, another detail began to surface. Quietly, almost unnoticed. A pattern in statements. Subtle inconsistencies that didn't stand out individually, but together formed something unexpected. Not a contradiction, not exactly, but a shift. In language, in tone, in the way certain moments were described and others avoided. And if that pattern means what some believe it means, then the biggest clue in this entire case wasn't physical evidence at all. It was psychological.